I have always been drawn to the mystique and eeriness of abandoned amusement parks. I grew up in Dartmouth, a coastal town in southeastern Massachusetts. And here, along Route 6, lies the remains of what was once known as Lincoln Park. The park opened in 1894 and through the years became the premier amusement park of southeastern Massachusetts. During its heyday, the park was always filled with thousands of patrons, most of whom rode the trolley in from nearby cities like New Bedford and Fall River. Lincoln Park was also a favorite stopping point for people traveling to and from Cape Cod via Route 6 during the years before the construction of Interstate 195. Unfortunately, I was not born in time to experience Lincoln Park in its prime. I was born in the 1980s, the decade in which so many classic amusement parks would meet their doom. My recollections of the park are faint at best. In those days, being so young, I spent all of my time in Kiddieland. Clouded memories of attractions like the car ride are the only things I remember about the old park. I was only 4 years old when Lincoln Park closed for good in 1987. In the years to follow, my family and I would spend an occasional day at Rocky Point Amusement Park in Warwick, Rhode Island. My memories there are much more vivid than those of Lincoln Park, as I frequented Rocky Point until the mid-1990s. Rocky Point, however, would eventually suffer the same fate as Lincoln Park. The park closed in 1996 and has quickly deteriorated into a vandalized wasteland. Here in Dartmouth, virtually nothing remains of Lincoln Park, as most of the main attractions were either auctioned off or destroyed by fires. The Comet, Lincoln Park's old wooden roller coaster, stands alone in the vacant lot. Its coat of white paint has chipped and faded away as the classic ride falls into further decay. 17 years have passed since trains of cars have screamed down these tracks, and I cannot help but wonder when the old structure will be demolished. Next to the Comet is what is left of Lincoln Park's 18-hole miniature golf course. The old putting greens are hardly recognizable, as the area has become a stamping ground for local paintball enthusiasts. The rest of the park's landscape is littered with a few concession stands. Somehow, the old buildings have dodged the ever-present risk of arson. My only real connection to the park occurs on my rare visits to Heritage Cove in Fall River. There, in a white building overlooking Battleship, Massachusetts and the Taunton River, one can ride the Lincoln Park Carousel, as the citizens of Fall River raised over $250,000 to salvage and restore the old ride. After the closings of Lincoln Park and Rocky Point, I was unaware of any more abandoned parks in the region. Yet all of that would change during my freshman year at Fitchburg State College in Massachusetts. During my first days at the school, I had decided to go for a drive and see the surrounding area. And sure enough, not far from the campus in Lunenburg sat the lifeless remains of Whalom Park, which closed the year before my arrival at Fitchburg State. The situation at Whalom is a lot different than that of Lincoln Park or Rocky Point. The park has only been closed for 4 years, as its last day of operation was in the fall of 2000. Most of the park's landscape remains intact. Whalom's old wooden roller coaster, the Flyer Comet, is still in decent condition. When compared to Lincoln Park's Comet, the Flyer Comet looks as if it's ready for another load of passengers. Although I never visited Whalom Park when it was open, I cannot help but wonder about its past. On the occasion that I drive by the old park, I often look at the empty fairgrounds and ask myself, what happened here?
Along Route 13 in Lunenburg lie the silent remains of the region's most crown jewel. Whalom Park closed in the fall of 2000, but for over 100 years served as the home of fun and recreation for the people of central Massachusetts. The memories created within this once bustling amusement park still live on in the hearts and minds of everyone who visited this historic landmark.
I remember attending here as a kid, the smells of the food cooking, cotton candy and hamburgers and fried dough, and the sounds of people riding. I could hear the sounds from my house. It was a half-mile away, and could hear the train whistle or sounds of people screaming when they went down the drop on the Flyer Comet. I could actually hear the sounds of the train being drawn up the lift hill.
Mom and dad and their kids, in tow and strollers, tagging behind, just watching them have a great time between the rides and the food, and it's just a really fun family type of atmosphere.
Kids would come and they'd be running around. The place used to be packed. You couldn't even move some days. There was so many people there.
Really, it was just an atmosphere of people coming to have a good time, and that really stands out in my memory. When I walk the park to this day, I can still visualize that.
Long before its days as a classic amusement park, the Whalom Park Fairgrounds were frequented as a rest and relaxation spot for the residents of its neighboring cities. Along the banks of Lake Whalom, families would gather to pitch their tents, eat picnic lunches, and enjoy the peaceful tranquility of the surrounding area.
It was a pine grove on the shores of this lake, and there was a little clearing near the lake.
It was very pastoral and very much lots of pine trees.
And it's reputed that this had been a gathering place since the time of the Indians. In the mid to late 1800s, a man named Nelson Lewis, who built a steamer landing and put a boat in the lake, built a dance hall and several other buildings with the intention of attracting horse-drawn carriage-based parties.
Eventually, Mr. Wesley Sargent and the Fitchburg and Leominster Street Railway Company would acquire the lease for the lakefront property. It was under Sargent's watch that the land was incorporated as a stop on the city's streetcar line.
Sargent saw the potential of this property as a destination for streetcar riders, and he acquired the lease to the property in 1892, and they constructed a streetcar line from Depot Square in Fitchburg right up Summer Street and then through the woods into what is now Whalom Park.
They moved their trolley lines out when they purchased this, so it was a place where people could get out of the city, away from the mills where most of them worked, to a country setting and have fun.
In 1893, Wesley Sargent and the railway company would officially open the property as Whalom Park.
It was very, very successful, and in 1894, the Fitchburg and Leominster Street Railway Company actually acquired the underlying title to the land and no longer just leased it.
During the late 1890s and early 1900s, Whalom would undergo a series of important expansions as a number of attractions were constructed throughout the property. By the 1920s, Whalom Park was beginning to develop into a classic amusement park. But in 1922, the park would suffer its first in a long line of destructive fires.
The earliest one that I know of was a 1922 fire that burned the bowling alley, which dated to the 1890s. That was one of the original structures at the park. That bowling alley was replaced with a row of buildings, one of which was a bowling alley, one of which was an arcade.
Despite the setback of its first fire, Whalom Park continued to expand well into the 1930s until a pair of devastating storms damaged much of the park's landscape in 1938.
There was a tornado that hit in August and a hurricane in September. The tornado damaged part of the Shooting Star roller coaster. Now, you have to keep in mind, that roller coaster was only 14 years old at that time. But the tornado actually took down a section of the track based on photographs that I've seen. But the hurricane, if there was any intention of repairing the Shooting Star roller coaster after the tornado in August, the hurricane pretty much leveled the whole end of the roller coaster that had the loading station, the lift chain, the first drop.
The second roller coaster was blown down in that hurricane, and many of the buildings were destroyed. And so many trees came down that they actually set up a sawmill on the property.
The destruction of the Shooting Star roller coaster prompted Whalom's owners to construct the Flyer Comet roller coaster in its place.
And this coaster was constructed during the 39 season and the end of the 39 season, and it officially opened July of 1940 as the Comet, utilizing most of the parts from the Shooting Star roller coaster.
It replaced a different kind of roller coaster, which was called an out and back, which is quite different in its style. It actually curved around the perimeter of the park, where this one is in a very defined area and makes a figure eight.
The Flyer Comet, which remains on the property to this day, was one of Whalom Park's most famous and cherished rides. Six years after the untimely storms in 1938, Whalom Park would suffer yet another devastating fire. This time, a number of attractions were destroyed along the park's midway in 1944.
That was a side of the midway that the park ownership wanted to reconstruct anyway, so it was fortuitous in one sense. It was awkward because I think it occurred like right before the park opening, and they ended up losing the Dodgems and several other attractions. But a new Dodgem building was constructed in 1948, and several other buildings as a result of that.
Following the 1944 fire, with a new midway in place, the park owners continued to bring in new attractions and began purchasing the existing rides from independent concessionaires.
The merry-go-round was bought by the park in 1956 from its concessionaire. The circle swing was probably the last, and the Custer cars were probably the last to be purchased by the park.
In the years following the Second World War, Whalom Park headed into its golden age, as the park now contained many signature rides and attractions. This glorious period in Whalom's history spawned the most precious memories in the hearts of the countless people who experienced it.
My favorite was the Carousel, which I restored in the 1970s. It was by far my favorite ride.
It was built by Charles Loof, and most of the animals on it at the time that the park acquired it in 1956 and at the time they sold it in 2000 were from the Loof factory. It wasn't until after taking it apart that I discovered that it was actually about 10 years older than everybody thought. At the time Whalom Park closed, that was the oldest American amusement ride operating an amusement park anywhere in the world.
I'm type of an old-fashioned type of person, so I kind of like the flying scooters. Well, the roller coaster was a lot of fun, but I really enjoyed the flying scooter ride probably as my favorite, because you got to do things on it. You were in control of the wing, so you were actually in control of the ride.
Some of the classic rides, the Tumble Bug and the Whip, definitely my favorites. And the Whip ride that was here was considered by park enthusiasts to be the best one in the country, probably the best one in the world. The Tumble Bug, at the time Whalom closed in 2000, was one of 3 remaining.
Because of the park's enormous popularity, Whalom also became a stopping point for many famous people throughout the years.
Guy Palmerton brought a lot of radio and screen personalities and later television personalities to the Whalom Playhouse during his 30-plus years of operating that facility.
I remember meeting Mickey Rooney, and I met Henry Morgan. Gloria Swanson was there. There were a lot of the big-name people were there.
You did have a lot of first-rate big bands that came, for example, during the 1930s and 40s. Many of these bands had recording contracts, and talking the Glenn Millers, the Tommy Dorseys, and some of their contemporaries.
You're probably familiar with Angela Lansbury because she's, an older famous actress. She came here in her youth and played at the Playhouse.
Whalom Park's pleasant atmosphere not only drew famous and average people alike, but also attracted many businesses as a place to hold their company outings.
Some people got here from various places around Massachusetts once a year with their company picnic, and it was a day that they would look forward to for weeks or months in advance.
All the big banks in Boston, most of the big corporate companies, probably the 60s and 70s and 80s and even to the 90s, held their picnics there. Hundreds of corporations came.
In addition to being a hotspot for fun and recreation in central Massachusetts, Whalom Park provided employment opportunities to hundreds of people from the surrounding area.
I would say we had mostly young people and older people, retired, on our staff in the summer. We had about 500 people on the payroll. It took 150 people per shift and a couple shifts a day. So it was a pretty vibrant place.
Well, mainly, I guess, my contributions were that I worked here for about 5 years, 6 years or so in the late 70s and early 80s when the park was really in its heyday. And I created the character the first year that they had them, created the Simon Looney Bear character. After that season, I operated the merry-go-round for a number of seasons and tried to make it sparkle the best it could.
By the late 1960s, Whalom Park began moving into the modern era.
And at that point in time, the park replaced a lot of the older rides with newer attractions, such as the Tilt-A-Whirl, the Scrambler, the Trabant, which replaced the Circle Swing, and so on.
In the spring of 1970, Whalom Park would suffer its first major fire in 36 years.
It was the night before opening day. There was a fire that wiped out the arcade building. That building was the one that was built with some of the salvaged lumber from the inn.
5 years after the fire that destroyed the arcade, Whalom Park would lose one of its most historic buildings to the same fate.
Then in 1975, a fire destroyed the empty Whalom Playhouse, the old theater, which had been built in 1901.
That was a big loss. That went back to the 1930s, 1920s. We had a lot of real important people that came out.
Despite having 2 major fires in the first half of a decade, Whalom Park continued to upgrade its facilities right up into the late 1970s. It was during this time period when some major additional expansions took place.
A new midway toward Route 13 was opened in like 1979 with the addition of some rides there. And then the acquisition of Robert Lufkin's estate, with his house becoming the office building and his backyard becoming the new Kittyland, which freed up the old Kittyland area for some additional attractions, such as most recently the Satellite Jet, the Sea Dragon, and the Flying Scooter ride.
During the winter of 1980, Whalom Park would suffer yet another fire to one of its most unique attractions.
The Pirate's Den was a fire that was not arson. It was actually a workman who left something too close to a heat source.
Following the major expansions of the late 1970s and the loss of the Pirates' Den in 1980, Whalom Park continued to push toward the future. But in the mid-1980s, the decade in which so many small amusement parks began to decline, Whalom Park would start to show signs of distress.
The foremost thing was probably bad management.
Poor management.
Bad management. Plain and simple bad management.
The park had very stable management for most of its existence. From its inception until the 1930s, Wesley Sargent himself managed the park. When Wesley Sargent either retired or when the park was sold in the 1930s, in 1937, I believe, Harold Gilmore was brought from Crescent Park in East Providence. He managed the park until 1967 when he retired, and he was replaced by his assistant manager, Will Frazier, who managed the park into the mid-80s. So you had managers who were here for 20, 30, or 40 years at a time. Will was hard to replace, and I think they went through a series of managers who stayed for a season or two at the most. And you lacked continuity, and I think you lacked a consistency of plan.
It was owned by several families, or most of it was owned by several families. And so you had, I think, family problems.
The Bowen family lost control of the park, and the people who came in didn't listen to the Bowen family, who had a lot of history about what things worked and what didn't, and it was the demise of the park.
The late 1990s and early 21st century would be the last years of Whalom Park's operation. The park began to lose money and attendance reached an all-time low. Though the park made its way into the new millennium, a dark cloud loomed overhead. Whalom Park was dying.
Then they went through some management in the 1990s that apparently brought about some bad feelings with the employees, and the park developed a reputation as a bad place to work. When you've got a business like this that's got a reputation as a good place to work, all the best students want to come here and work for their summer job, and they're serious people and good workers. Once you have the reputation as a bad place to work, you're relegated to scraping the bottom of the barrel. The last season, I was here, and they were playing horribly obnoxious music over the loudspeaker system. They were trying to attract teenagers. They didn't want to make the investment into the kinds of rides that they needed to attract teenagers. This always was a good family park.
I think the addition of your big theme parks, I think Whalom Park was basically a kiddie park. We had a lot of smaller rides that the small children loved. And I think the thrill parks like Riverside, which is now Six Flags, people want to go for the big thrill rides. They're not interested in the smaller, rides.
The owners of the park lost their focus as to what it was about this park that made it successful. And what it was a place for families, particularly families with young children, to come and relax and have a good time. Once management decided that they wanted to try to compete, I think, with the bigger parks that were putting lots of money into the parks, and management here, the owners, wanted to compete without putting significant investment into the park, that's when I think management got its eye off the ball and they started to lose money.
By autumn of the year 2000, Whalom Park had reached the end of the line. The park closed its gates for the last time, and soon the rides were auctioned off to various places around the country.
Well, there's one that's in storage in a garage down in Pennsylvania. That's the merry-go-round is in storage down in Pennsylvania. Most of the rides have been purchased by other parks. The Allen Herschel Looper and the Satellite Jet ride are going to Twin Grove Park. The Flying Scooter ride and the Whip ride were two of the first to go. They went to Storyland in Glen, New Hampshire. Edaville purchased the Tumble Bug, the Tilt-A-Whirl, the Kittyland Astronaut ride, and the Scrambler. Little America Park now has the lift chain and the motor from the Flyer Comet roller coaster. Two of the rides went to Finelli Amusements. John Finelli purchased the Ferris wheel and the yo-yo. The only other ride that went out of here intact, I guess, would be the airborne ride, the Super Trooper, and that went to Puerto Rico. There are really two rides left on the property, and aside from the roller coaster structure, and that's the Rotojet ride and the Bouncer ride, and there's one individual who is taking those out a little at a time.
So what are you using of it, and what are you?
Oh, we'll use all these upright posts and the glass.
Excellent.
But it's pretty well coming together.
Excellent. So it's going to Kennecott Camp?
Kennecott Camp. Yeah. This slide will be going for another 20 years.
In 2002, after sitting virtually untouched for 2 years, Whalom Park suffered its first case of arson since its closing.
And the last fire to strike the park was unfortunately set by vandals. Two approximately 16-year-old youths from Lunenburg set fire to the ballroom, which had been constructed in 1933.
Of course, had a lot of big bands there, Guy Lombardo, Harry James, all your big name bands were there in the 30s and 40s, and that was a big loss.
A lot of sentimental value also. Many, many couples met at dances there, dancing to the music of the big bands. Unfortunately, that was one of the few buildings that the party who was negotiating to buy the park at the time wanted to keep. And that now, of course, is lost to posterity as well.
Today, the rumored plans for the property's future do not include a park of any kind.
I got a gut feeling it's just going to be turning into a little condominium complex, and basically it'll change the whole lakefront. They say they want to see it, the condos, but I don't know. I think once they're here, people are going to miss the place.
If I had a wish, I would ask them to sell it to the Bowen family, and we would try to revive it. But with only 40% and other people who would rather sell it for other things, I really don't know.
I wish I was a multimillionaire. I'd bring it back to its old, its way it was before. And I know some people would like to see that happen.
I would like to see the community realize what they're losing, because you can take an area, you could take an attraction that made this place unique and I think a special place to live, and you can turn that property into something that is still an asset to the community and makes it a better place to live and a special place to live, or you can turn it into something that everybody else has got, which is too many townhouses.
Currently, Whalom Park silently sits awaiting an uncertain future. Most of the rides and attractions have been taken away, and what is left on the premises must face a blistering summer sun and paralyzing winter snow. Even after just 4 years of being closed, a heartbreaking sight awaits anyone who visits the unkempt fairgrounds. For over 100 years, Whalom Park served as the playground for the people of central Massachusetts. And despite an unfortunate demise, its infamous legacy lives on, permanently fixed in the hearts and minds of everyone who experienced the magic of Whalom Park.
I mean, it's got to be millions of people who have gone through that park in that 100 years. And I think it's going to be the good times that people remember and the memories that the park created for so many families.
You had a wonderful time at Whalom if you were here with your best friend, if you were here with your sister or brother, if you were here with your parents, you were here with your grandparents. It was multi-generational fun, and it was just exciting.
To me, it was like a magical place. It was, they gave me a detail of work there. It was actually work, but it was fun too.
You know what, everybody I talk to, everybody remembers it as a kid. You know, you guys are a little younger, but most of us were all up there in age, and everybody has their stories about when they came here when they were 10 and 11, and I'm the exact same way. I can remember going on some of these rides that were just left recently. It's a lot of memories for us when we were kids, and like I say, I wish this little guy would have got a chance to enjoy it, but he didn't, so.
This park beat the odds by surviving into the 21st century as a place where people could go for old-fashioned family-oriented entertainment.
So often, I look at the current state of Whalom Park and compare it to that of Lincoln Park in Dartmouth. It is sad to think that without some sort of intervention, the residents of central Massachusetts could be left with an unsalvageable wasteland. Even if new condominiums are constructed in the park's place, they will surely lack the public enthusiasm for the treasure that once existed on this abandoned lot. I urge the people of central Massachusetts to pause and reflect on the countless number of cherished memories they have of Whalom Park. Only by banding together in a single cause can we stop the destruction of this most historic landmark.